evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. We're back, baby. We took a little bit of a space back from the live shows for a little bit there because there was that whole horrifying thing that Danielle Smith did and continues to be doing in regards to eliminating, attacking trans people and eliminating choice and everything else. And we wanted to make sure that we highlighted some voices that actually had some expertise. So it's been, I think, 2 weeks, maybe 3. I don't know. Time's so complicated since we've done a live show, but we're back and we've got a monster show planned out for you tonight. And then we've got this little curveball that we have to address off the top. So this wasn't quite how we had the show laid out. We'll get back into the groove of things in just a little bit here, but about an hour and a half before we were all ready to go, some news broke. So let's get into it. To start with, on Friday, after much speculation, after many rumors, it was finally announced that the federal government, the coalition federal government, the NDP and the Liberals, had finally reached an agreement on a national Pharmacare program. Now, this happened Friday. Now, in regards to what the program is going to be providing, there's a lot of details that we don't know yet. There's a lot of things that haven't been publicly released. The legislation hasn't been presented in Parliament yet. So we don't know all of the specifics. And that's one of the really important things to highlight right out of the gates. The exact details of the program are not completely known. But there are some details that are. It's rumored that the program is going to be coming at a cost of about $1 billion. What's it going to cover? Well, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh said the deal will mean that people no longer have to pay for prescription birth control, intrauterine devices, the morning after pill, and the abortion pill. So it's going towards a wide range of contraceptives. And in particular, it's worth highlighting that when we're talking about the prescription birth control, very often that's not just used to prevent the babies. It's also used for a wide variety of medical conditions. And this is really important to understand because this is a program that's going to reach much farther than just the not the babies. Because it's also one of the other things that NDP leader alluded to or straight up said was it's also going to have some pretty significant impact for diabetics. On diabetes medication, Mr. Singh said a broad range of drugs will be covered, including insulin, insulin-like medication, and affiliated medicines. He didn't specify what medicines will come under those categories. But right out of the gates, right there, that's a huge, important, really big deal because it's going to provide coverage for diabetes medicines. That's really, really big for a lot of Canadians. So, to recap where we are so far, program was announced on Friday. It's going to include birth control, contraceptives. It's going to include diabetic medication. And it took a sum total of, let me make sure I get this right here, 2 fucking days before the province of Alberta managed to shit itself into oblivion when the Minister of Health, in an email to Global News on Sunday, this literally came out like 2 hours ago. In an email to Global News on Sunday, Alberta's health minister said that if the federal government pursues a national Pharmacare program, Alberta intends to opt out and instead intends to obtain a full per capita share of the funding. So, to be clear, a program of which the details have not been announced that would be of presumably an incredible help to anybody accessing any form of birth control, whether it's for the purposes of birth control or for managing a variety of medical problems. Huge help to them, huge help to diabetics. And 2 days later, even though the specifics of the program aren't known, 2 days later, the Minister of Health comes out and says, you know what? We're not a real big fan of this program, but we'll take the money instead. Presumably to run the Alberta version of a national Pharmacare program. Let me just say that again. The Smith and government and the UCP want to be trusted to run a provincial Pharmacare program. They want a blank check from the federal government to run. They've already done this, and they shit the bed on it. This is unbelievable. It is mind-blowing that Smith and the UCP, after flushing away $100 million of Alberta's taxpayers' money, would then say, hey, there's this billion-dollar program that's being rolled out to provide this essential health care for people that otherwise can't get it. We'd like to try again, please. If there was any indication that this government had any ability whatsoever to learn from their mistakes, there might be an argument for this, but we've seen no indication. If anything, we've seen obfuscation, we've seen straight up lies, and we have seen the waste of literally $100 million of taxpayers' money on exactly this. It's mind-blowing that the provincial government, without even knowing the details of the program, would come out and say, nah, we want to do it ourselves because we think we can do it better. When there's tens of millions of dollars of taxpayers' money that they're never going to see any return on because Danny rushed into a drug deal with Dr. Oz's mom's company for drugs they didn't even make. The vast majority of which that we even received are now just going to rot away in storage because, well, Danny promised that we might be able to sell them to other people. Turns out nobody wants the off-brand knockoff Tylenol. But Danny and co. now want to be able to get their hands on the money that's supposed to go towards making sure that diabetics and people who want access to contraception don't get access to it unless it goes through them. There are some areas where provincial autonomy, or provincial sovereignty, I suppose, as Danielle Smith would say, are appropriate. There are some areas that are absolutely provincial jurisdiction. There's no argument against that. But when the federal government comes together with a program that is designed to help the lives of people who don't have access to employer benefits or who don't have access to other social assistance programs, for the average Albertan, the average Canadian, for them to just say, nah, you know what? It's just not worth it for us. We'd rather have the money, please. It's absolutely mind-blowing. I needed the glasses to read that. This is aging me. This bullshit. Now, we're probably going to get into that more when we get into the open mic section of the show, but we wanted to get it out of the way off the top because we've been getting no shortage of DMs from people saying, hey, you going to cover this? Yeah, we're going to talk about this. And as you'll see as we go out throughout the show, there are plenty of reasons why Danielle Smith and the provincial government shouldn't necessarily be put in a position where they have to take on, I don't know, the burden, maybe, the extra work of running a Pharmacare program because they can't even manage what's on their plates today. But it turns out, as we get into our regular program and I swing into a clumsy seg, it turns out Pharmacare isn't the only thing that the UCP want to ban in Alberta. Came out this week that on January 22nd, Alberta Gaming Liquor and Cannabis sent letters to 106 out-of-province wineries saying they had to stop selling their products direct to consumers. So these wineries aren't allowed to sell direct to consumers anymore, or they would have their wines banned from liquor store shelves in Alberta and by extension from restaurants. There's a lot of things that Daniel Smith and the UCP have borrowed from other places over the time, but a wine ban circa Rachel Notley is not one of the things that I think a lot of people expected to see coming, especially with some of the much, much bigger issues that the province is facing and will continue to face for quite some time. The first one of those issues that we want to talk about is wildfires, because there's been some rather alarming news that has come out in regards to how ready the province of Alberta is for wildfires. This week, the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees says Alberta Wildfire typically brings on 400 to 500 staff for the spring. The spokesperson says he believes the province is poised to miss that mark and won't be able to train newly hired firefighters properly. We won't have, the chiefs have asked. We have asked. The fire chiefs have asked. Numerous organizations have asked for pretty much an idea of what their plan is, and their plan is nothing, Galt said. Our belief would be to have that, plan would be to allow whatever happens to happen, to get the crews out and then bring in 4,000 people like we did last year to try to stop the wildfires. So the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees is saying, hey, you know what? We've got this wildfire problem in this province, and it's looking like it's going to be a rough season, because it turns out the season has actually already started. Looking at the Alberta Provincial Wildfire Status Dashboard, there are 56. It's February. We're doing this show on February 25th. There are 56 wildfires going in the province of Alberta right now. Of those, there's a bunch of them that are carryover, but there are 27 that are current wildfires for this year. It's February, and there are 56 wildfires currently burning in the province of Alberta. Now, the good news is none of them are out of control, but the bad news is there's 56 wildfires already going in the province of Alberta, and multiple agencies are saying we're not ready for what's coming. But don't worry, because Todd Loewen and co. paid somebody to dress in a beaver costume to demonstrate how prepared the province is for wildfires, because they found, I guess, the falafel costume sold, so they decided to go with the Bertie Beaver. And, you know, if you were pitching this to maybe elementary school kids, then that would be, you know, a justifiable communication strategy. But when you're posting this to platforms like X, where presumably there's not a whole lot of 7-year-olds who are going to go, oh, look, it's somebody in a beaver costume, I feel safer already. It's a fascinating choice. But an even more fascinating choice that came from the announcement was the continued insistence of Rick McIver to wear sunglasses in any video presentation that he does. We've seen him do this on multiple occasions before. When he was first sworn into Danielle Smith's cabinet, he was there rocking the sunnies. And while this might seem like a pedantic little thing to poke on, the reality is that anybody who has any kind of experience in communications knows that if you're speaking to people, even if it's through a camera, putting any sort of barrier in the way makes that communication a lot more, inauthentic, a lot more, disingenuous. Barriers aren't good. Sunglasses are exactly that. But this is something that Rick has persistently and consistently done. He likes to rock his sunnies. But when you take a step back and you think about it, when you think about the fact that maybe the province is being caught with their pants down, they're not prepared, and they've got their sunglasses on, and they're engaging in some risky business, maybe all of a sudden this makes a little bit more sense. Moving on from there, one of the other problems that the province of Alberta is facing and is ultimately going to have to reconcile with, because not only is it going to be a huge problem in and of itself, but it's also going to directly correlate with how effectively the province is able to fight wildfires, has to do with the drought situation in the province of Alberta. And it's bad. It's not just like a little bit bad, it's really bad. To run through some of the water shortages that are going on from this story that was put up by the Tyee, there are currently 51 water shortage advisories in place for select water management areas across Alberta. It's likely that these advisories will remain in place over the winter months. And here's how bad it actually is. At the Old Man Reservoir, the current storage, and we're going to have some questions about this, we'll show in just a sec, the current storage is 30%. Normal for this time of year is between 61 and 80%. The St. Mary Reservoir, current storage is 18%. Normal storage for this time of year is between 48 and 75%. The Pine Coulee Reservoir, current storage is 28%. Normal for this period of year is between 74 and 91%. But how bad is it really? Like, those are abstract numbers. It's not like people have posted, I don't know, pictures on the internet that actually show the Old Man Reservoir completely dried up, apocalypse style, with the cracks on the bottom of the reservoir visible. You can walk across it now. I don't even know, looking at these pictures, how you get to 30%. Based on these pictures. Now, these pictures come from a Twitter account that posted them a couple days ago, Philip Meitzner, given full credit. And these were actually pictures that a colleague of his posted to emphasize the severity of the situation, because it really is that bad. It's also important to realize that as much as Alberta likes to talk about being the breadbasket of Canada, and we do produce a lot of food, there's no question about that, a lot of it is heavily reliant on irrigation. If you know the history of southern Alberta, you know that when people came to the province of Alberta to push out all the First Nations folks, but also to create all of that agriculture, there were huge infrastructure projects that were started in order to make sure that all of the fields and areas got the water that they needed. And so to see the reservoirs that feed that irrigation literally dried to the bottom is something that should give everybody serious concern. Because not only is this going to have a tremendous impact on the ability for those farmers, but it's also going to have a tremendous impact on the ability for people to get the water that they need to survive. And we're already seeing that happening. On Thursday of this week, the Crow's Nest River literally ran dry. The river, an essential source for South Saskatchewan River system, ran dry Thursday upstream of the village of Cowley. Now unable to extract water from its intake pipe, the municipal district of Pincher Creek has dug a pit in the river bottom to take subsurface water by trucks and emergency pipes. They had to dig a hole in the river to get through the river bed, because the river's run dry, to get to the water that had seeped into the bottom of the river, because the water level dropped, zero's pretty low, below where the pipes that feed Pincher Creek could even get the water. And again, it's February. This is a serious crisis in this province, particularly in southern Alberta. And it's also important to realize that above and beyond water for things like, living and agriculture and keeping farm animals alive and it's also a resource that's heavily utilized by industry. And we've talked particularly recently about the fracking industry and how that is literally pumping water into the ground in order to fracture the rocks to get out oil and gas. There's no small amount of water that goes into that. So the water shortage has a lot of significant impacts. And when we're talking about water supply, you might think that the province would be pumping the brakes on anything that could potentially negatively impact the water supply. But we also saw, just recently, the news came through that the Grassy Mountain project is back in debate. It's back in running. So the Alberta Energy Regulator accepted the Rocky Mountain coal mine application. They're planning on going ahead with a public hearing. There's a lot of people who thought this thing was dead and done with, but the company that was originally trying to do it very cleverly changed their name. So you see, it's a whole new thing. But as Minister of Energy Brian Jean argued, well, it's a whole new thing, but it's also an existing project. In an internal letter dated Thursday, the Alberta Energy Regulator says it made its decision after receiving clarification from Energy Minister Brian Jean about whether or not Northback's Grassy Mountain proposal should be exempted from a moratorium on coal development in these landscapes. So the AER wasn't jumping ahead to go with this because there is a moratorium that was put in place by the UCP. They said they weren't going to do this. But Brian Jean says, nah, it's cool, y'all. We'll call this an existing project, and you can go ahead and do this. There's a lot of people who are very upset about this. Cor Blond, Alberta country singer from Tabor. He had some thoughts. He was in the news this week. I met with Brian Jean to discuss the coal issue a couple of months ago, and I was alarmed by how little he knew. Lund sent an email to the Canadian press. I knew more about the coal issue than he did, and I'm just a guitar player, not the Minister of Energy. It's chilling to me that ill-informed politicians are making decisions about our water. And it's a very valid point. Because one of the big conversation pieces that came up the last time we dealt with this issue had to do with the fact that there were already leachings into the water supply from coal. And one of the products that leaches into the water supply is something called selenium. Now, selenium, like all things, and a little bit of it, it's not bad. Doesn't cause any problems. But when we start to talk about the levels that we see coming out of these areas, it turns into really bad really, really quickly. Because at the numbers that it leaches out, it can get toxic. And when we start to take a look at where the water all flows from, the Grassy Mountain project, some people argue, could put large parts of Alberta's water supply at risk of being exposed to high levels of selenium, which would make it not safe for drinking, not safe for agriculture. So at a time where the province is already facing a major drought, going ahead with something like this is unbelievably risky. Now, it's worth noting that what the AER has said is that this can go to a public hearing to determine how the public feels about it. So this is another one of those issues where it's going to be critically important that Albertans show up and make their voices heard. Because if you don't, it seems like Brian Jean has already made his mind up about this. Moving on from there. We got to talk about victim services. Because there's some changes that are being proposed to how victim services are being provided, particularly in rural Alberta. The RMA president of Rural Municipalities of Alberta he had some pretty hard quotes for the province. The Alberta government is pushing ahead with the consolidation of 60 current victim service units into 4 integrated regional societies. So instead of having all of these local societies, which are usually based out of like RCMP detachments, they tend to rely on volunteers, people who want to make sure that they're supporting the people in their community when they're the victims of a very bad thing. Instead of having all of those local services in the communities, they want to move it all to these 4 super centers, if you will. Now, the quote that came from the president of the RMAs, they have yet to convince me with any of the rationale that's been communicated by this government on why they're even doing this. And we just continue to be exhausted by the movement of the government to want to go down this path, McLaughlin said. It makes no sense. Now, it's worth remembering that McLaughlin was the guy and the RMA was the organization that Smith was happy to throw under the bus and say, hey, you know what, with the whole renewables moratorium, it was the RMAs, they asked for it. We're just listening to the will of the people. And then the president of the RMA said, well, we're excited and we're glad that these issues are being addressed, but we didn't ask for a moratorium. We didn't ask for this. We still don't know, although we can safely speculate, why it is that Danielle Smith even introduced the moratorium, where those ideas came from. Don't worry, we're coming to it. Next up, we got to talk about the Health Sciences Association of Alberta. They released a fascinating little press release earlier in the week where they raised some concerns about a frontline healthcare freeze. Now, one of the things that's been promised by Danielle Smith in the UCP as they go about the work of fracturing AHS into 4 separate organizations as opposed to the integrated healthcare system that's the envy of many parts of the world, because silos, I guess, are prettier. I don't know. Nobody who has any experience in healthcare is advocating for this explosion of an integrated healthcare system that removes barriers. Almost everybody is arguing for the fact that the explosion of AHS into 4 separate organizations is actually going to put barriers up for people receiving care. But that's all a separate thing, which we'll also get to in a little bit. But Danielle Smith, she promised, no, there won't be any impacts on frontline healthcare hiring. Well, HSAA, or the Health Sciences Association of Alberta, has a very different version of events. On February 20th, AHS sent an email to HSAA outlining plans for cost management strategies on hiring that require senior operating officer approval for all frontline position recruitment. This applies to AHS, Alberta Precision Labs, Care West, and Capital Care. It was identified that this is being done to find the required cost savings to manage an operating deficit. And here's the catch. The next day, HSAA received reports that AHS canceled recruitment for critical frontline healthcare positions. We are very concerned that just a few months into the restructuring of healthcare, commitments being made by this government to healthcare professionals are not being honored, and addressing the staffing crisis is not the top priority. Which is pretty damning. Because again, it seems like one of the things that everybody agrees on is that there's a shortage of frontline healthcare workers in the province of Alberta. This is one of the reasons why the UCP says that they're expanding the ease for people who are credentialed in healthcare outside of Alberta, outside of Canada, to get into the healthcare system quicker. It's one of the reasons why they're opening up new programs in private schools, providing them funding to train people to work in healthcare. So there's no question that there's a shortage of frontline healthcare workers, and the claims by HSAA that critical frontline healthcare positions are not being hired for should be something that alarms just about every Albertan. But equally alarming, we got to talk about some new stats in regards to the toxic drug supply. Alana Smith has been doing an incredible job of following the stats and the ongoing story of how successful, and I'm air quoting that for all of our audio listeners, the Alberta model has been in regards to mitigating deaths from the toxic drug supply. Her tweet here, another 140 of Albertans died from drug poisonings last November, shows new provincial data that brings the death toll to roughly 1,840 for the first 11 months of 2023. At this rate, Alberta will break another annual record for deaths. From her story, the provincial government has been reporting these deaths since 2016. The latest figures it has released are from last October. According to these numbers, there have been 1,692 fatalities in the province from drug poisonings in the last 10 months of 2023, the majority linked to opioids. But it's critically important to highlight here that when we're talking about linked to opioids, it's not just the opioids. It's all of the other stuff that's mixed into the drug supply. If the figures from the last 2 months of the year continue at this pace, 2023 will surpass the previous deadliest year of the province's toxic drug crisis, 2021, when 1,869 fatal drug poisonings were recorded. There were only about 1,500 drug fatalities in the first 10 months of 2021. Nearly 200 Albertans died last April, marking another bleak milestone, the highest number of deaths recorded in a single month. Now, there's no question those numbers are unacceptable. There's no question that people should not be dying from a toxic drug supply. There's also no question that there is very real evidence to demonstrate how the impact of a toxic drug supply can be mitigated. And we've had a couple of conversations with NDP leadership candidates. We're going to be dropping another one on Wednesday, where we sit down and have a brief little chat with none other than Kathleen Ganley. And we do talk about safe supply with her. We did talk about safe supply with everybody that we've spoken to so far. We're going to continue to ask all of these NDP leadership candidates that we can get on the show what their thoughts are on exploring evidence-based administration of safe supply to prevent numbers like these ones that we're talking about. But there's also no question that part of the conversation absolutely has to include recovery. And this is another area where, as much as Daniel Smith and the UCP and Marshall Smith like to tout the Alberta model, there's some pretty serious flaws that still exist in it. An organization that spent years urging the Alberta government to proclaim the creation of the Professional College for Counselling Therapists now has the support of two organizations that represent the majority of First Nations in the province. So Treaty 6 First Nations and Treaty 8 First Nations have said, yeah, there should be regulation for people who are providing counseling, especially addictions counseling in the province of Alberta. And it might surprise some of the people who are listening to or watching the show right now to find out there's not. There's no professional college that oversees people who claim to be drug counselors in the province of Alberta. That doesn't exist. All of the framework is in place. But the UCP, for reasons, I guess, has been dragging their heels for literally years in making sure that the people who are providing counseling, addictions counseling, or all the other different kinds of counseling, the people who are providing those counseling services are actually qualified to do so. And they're held to professional standards that they have to meet in order to be able to treat and work with vulnerable populations like people who are trying to enter recovery. It doesn't exist in the province of Alberta. Anybody can put up a shingle. And the example that's cited in this story has to do with a physician who lost her medical license because of some very bad choices, negligent, dangerous, some might even say abusive choices. And she's now advertising herself as an addictions counselor because she can. This is part of the Alberta model. Moving on from there. Take a quick little sip because this is a long one. We have spent several episodes covering Danielle Smith's new policy set that she's not allegedly going to be introducing this legislative session, but rather that she's going to be introducing in the fall legislative session right around the same time of her leadership review. It's a wild coincidence, totally inexplicable. But nonetheless, we saw at the end of January, Danielle Smith introduced a policy set where she not only targeted, and again, I'm going to use the same metaphor that we've been using on the show for a while now. Danielle Smith threw a great big target up on the wall, and at the very, very center of that target, where she wants everybody to focus their attention, it seems, is trans kids and supports and treatment for trans kids and trans youth. But that's not the only part of the target. There's a lot of other pieces of that target that appear to have been included with the hopes that everybody's going to be super focused on the trans kids piece and maybe we won't notice all of these other things. And it's all being done under the auspices of parental rights. That was the original sales pitch. But a lot of people very quickly pointed out, actually, what you're doing is taking away parental rights. You're limiting parental rights. You're limiting parental choice. And you're also limiting adult choice, because the policies apparently include restrictions on adult sport and who can play adult sports in what leagues and when they can play with them. It's a whole thing. So it's not just targeting trans kids. It's targeting a lot of other things, including creating an opt-in requirement for any sort of sexual education and a notification, not just if somebody wants to change their names or pronouns, but a notification system if a kid decides to live as out, which is, quite frankly, absolutely appalling. And it's going to put kids at risk. And as we have heard from people who are experts in this field over the last couple of weeks, and people who have real lived experience over the last couple of weeks, it is going to get kids killed, period. Kids are going to die because of this policy set. But Danielle Smith has justified this policy set in a number of ways, most of which have very little, if nothing, to do with, what's the word I'm looking for? Yes, facts. She's created a bunch of arguments that a lot of people, including Vashi Kapelis, did, offered up a masterclass in how to deal with an interview with Danielle Smith. We'd still love to have you on, Danny. And how to deal with her when she unleashes the Gish Gallop or the torrent of bullshit. Well, one of the stories that came up very recently had to do with fact-checking Danielle Smith's claims about all of the examples that she likes to use in Europe. And she keeps talking about Norway and Finland and Denmark and all of these countries. They're shutting it all down. They're shutting it down. And when you actually take a look at what these countries are doing, that's not what's happening at all. In Norway, there's no law prohibiting gender-affirming surgeries. For those under the age of 18, chest surgery may be appropriate in special cases based on, wait for it, a comprehensive interdisciplinary assessment and parental consent. Oh, so in Norway, they recognize the parents should be able to consent to treatment and trans-affirming care. And they also recognize that the medical experts are, in fact, the medical experts who should be making these decisions. In Finland, puberty suppression treatment may be initiated on a case-by-case basis after careful consideration and appropriate diagnostic examinations. So again, the decision should be made by the medical experts, not the ideological politicians. In Denmark, there is no minimum age requirement for hormone blockers, and the decision to get treatment can be made by a young adult over 15, even if parents disagree. And in exceptional cases, referral for breast surgery may be offered. So as much as Danielle Smith is trying to paint this picture for all of the bigots on social media to go, but Norway and Denmark and Finland and all of those other countries, they don't allow any of this. They've recognized that they have to stop. And that's not at all what's happening. What all of these countries are doing is recognizing that there needs to be evidence-based care for trans-affirming care. Now, all of this, again, focuses on the bullseye at the center of the target. And it's important to highlight as well, all of the other issues that we talked about are still very much in play. She is absolutely impacting the choices of adults on who they want to play sports with. She is very much impacting the access to sexual education in the province of Alberta. There's a lot of other moving pieces going on. But the biggest thing to take away is almost all of the justifications that Danielle Smith has offered have either been purely emotional arguments or they've been total bullshit. And we're starting to see more and more people start to call them out. The Edmonton Public Schools issued a letter where they addressed in the politest of terms their concerns with these new policies. To read a couple of sections from the letter. For a variety of reasons, there are cases when a parent or guardian is not able to provide the support a student needs, or cases when a student wishes support from a non-family member before sharing information about their identity. For these situations, it is critical to preserve the respectful, safe, and caring spaces and established relationships created in schools and which are already required through the Education Act. Another section. Requiring parents to opt in does not serve to add any additional parental control. It simply adds administrative red tape to important lessons set out in the Alberta provincial curriculum. Another section, and this is, again, one of the ones that's really important, because Danielle Smith has said multiple times, she broadly consulted. The consultation, it was broad. There was like 4 people that we think she talked to, maybe. As a division educating 1/6 of the province's students, we were disappointed to first hear of these policy considerations through the media. However, we believe we can still add value to future conversations. We respectfully request a robust, authentic, and meaningful consultation process involving Edmonton Public Schools and other school divisions across the province before any changes are implemented, which isn't a huge ask, especially when it comes to the sex ed stuff, because one of the things that we've covered off on the show before is teachers. One of the big causes of teachers burning out, and one of the reasons why so many teachers are leaving the industry, is because of the administrative burden. Creating an opt-in policy only increases that administrative burden. Creating notification for any time that teachers have a conversation about gender or sexuality or gender identity or any of those things creates more administrative burden. So it's not just a moral question or an emotional question. There's real logistics that need to be figured out here. And apparently, Danielle Smith didn't talk to any of the experts in any of the fields. She just gathered a few anecdotal stories from a few people who had opinions, and as many other people have pointed out, extensive trauma. And she used those to justify her decisions. And a lot of people have been very clear. They got some pretty strong ideas about where the motivation for these policies have come from. A lot of people have been very clear. There's a leadership review coming up for Danielle Smith at the next UCP AGM, which will be at the beginning of November, which is only a week into the legislative session, the fall legislative session, where Smith has said that she's going to introduce these policies. And we know Take Back Alberta has full control of the UCP board right now. We also saw at the last UCP AGM that David Parker and Take Back Alberta are able to motivate a lot of people to come out and buy memberships and vote for policies that are not evidence-based, incredibly regressive, harmful to the province of Alberta, not only from a moral and ethical standpoint, but also from an economic one. So it's important that we take a quick sec to talk about the reaction of Mr. Parker to these announcements. So let's take a second and talk about David Parker. Oh, sorry, I'm being told that that's not actually David Parker. Let's try the next graphic. No. Also, that's not striking resemblance. But again, no, that's not David Parker. I think here we go. There's the guy, David Parker. He had a Take Back Alberta Zoom meeting recently where he expressed his thoughts on Danielle Smith's policies, as well as his planned reaction to them.
One of the exciting things that I'd like to announce on this Zoom call is that I spoke recently with Danielle Smith to ask her whether or not she was getting a lot of support for this policy. She told me that usually she gets about 4,000 emails. She's getting 22,000 emails a day right now. 90% of them are supportive. A lot of that is due to the efforts of many of the people on this call. So I want to thank you, because I've not done as much as I could to show my gratitude to the Premier for standing up against this insane woke ideology. But I believe that we need to do that. And that's the first thing that I would like to discuss tonight. I'd like to announce that we're going to be having 2 rallies, one in Edmonton, one in Calgary. We have not got the date yet, but our goal is to have 10,000 people in Edmonton and 10,000 people in Calgary. We want this to be a family-friendly event. We want 10,000 people at both events. And the purpose of this event is to thank Danielle Smith publicly for standing up for our rights. In the coming days, we'll be announcing special speakers that will be speaking at these rallies. We may also have a rally in Red Deer if there is enough interest.
I love that he ends that with, if there's enough interest in Red Deer. He thinks he's going to be able to get 10,000 people out to Edmonton and 10,000 people out to Calgary, but he's not sure if there's going to be support for this in Red Deer. Like, I'm sorry, Red Deer, but y'all have a bit of a reputation. And to suggest that Mr. Parker's going to find more support in Edmonton and Calgary than he's going to be able to find in Red Deer is moderately unhinged, I guess would be the word. I'm not sure. But there's some other stuff in that video that we need to take a second to unpack. I mean, the whole, we're going to make it family friendly. I mean, have you seen David Parker's speaking style? Because he's done some rallies before and he gets very loud and let's go with Haiti. He's got a not particularly family-friendly speaker style. It's going to be fascinating to see what the other speakers are. I wonder if they'll get Tucker back. But the biggest thing to take away of this call, especially given some of David Parker's recent antics on social media, where he said some really horrifying things about a lot of people, ostensibly just to get some impressions on the Twitter machine. He's talking about the fact that he's still talking to Smith. He's still talking to Smith about policies. Danielle Smith is still very much taking David Parker's calls about policies. Now, whether or not Danielle Smith is actually getting 22,000 emails a day from Albertans, 90% of which are positive, that's turning into a bit of a big fish story. And as we talked about earlier, a lot of the lakes have dried up. So it's questionable as to whether or not those numbers are anywhere near accurate. But the big takeaway is that Danielle Smith is still very much taking David Parker's phone calls, despite everything that he's been doing, which says a lot about Danielle Smith. But Take Back Alberta is kind of riding high right now because their former, allegedly, organizer, Benita Peterson, was a big part of a petition that everybody saw happen in Westlock. Now, this was a whole big stupid shit show because the town of Westlock voted to put in a rainbow crosswalk. The horror. A rainbow crosswalk. And a bunch of people lost their minds, one of which was Benita Peterson. And so they utilized a petition pathway where if you get enough signatures on a petition and you force a vote, well, the town's given 2 choices. Either they can just say, okay, yeah, we're going to make this a law, or we're going to have a vote on it. And the town council, who is in support, to be clear, the town council overwhelmingly in support of the rainbow crosswalk. The town council was very, very clear that they didn't want to just declare it, and that meant their only other option was a vote. And this was an incredibly poorly attended vote. The question on the petition was, do you agree that only federal, provincial, and municipal flags may be flown on flagpoles in the town of Westlock municipal property? All crosswalks in the town of Westlock must be the standard white striped pattern between 2 existing parallel lines. The existing rainbow crosswalk in the town of Westlock must be removed. That's what the petition question was. For that question, 663 people voted yes, 639 people voted no. So by a vote of 24 this passed. But it's important to highlight that it's not just rainbow flags that are going to be excluded on federal, provincial, on the flagpoles on the town of Westlock municipal property. It also includes any kind of flag that recognizes veterans. It also includes any kind of flag that recognizes any of the Indigenous or First Nations or Métis communities in that area. So it's really locking down what can go on the flagpoles. But what a lot of people have pointed out is that there's nothing on here about sidewalks. So a nice little rainbow sidewalk, that could be entirely appropriate. But as horrifying as this is, and it is horrifying because when you think about the message that this sends to any kids in the town of Westlock who are LGBTQ2S+, it's a devastating message to receive from your community. But the response has been kind of awesome because people across the country are stepping up to make sure that even though you can't see the rainbow and the crosswalk anymore, there's lots of different ways to see the rainbow. Dr. Christopher Wells tweeted out, thanks to an amazing donor, hundreds of these lawn signs are coming to Westlock very soon. Pride can't be canceled via vote. You'll soon see the most rainbows ever in Westlock's history. And it came out that the donation for the shipping for these signs came from a lawyer out in Eastern Canada. They also provided the PDFs so that if anybody wants to print these signs on their own, they can. So as much as kids will not be able to see a rainbow crosswalk, they're hopefully going to see a lot of these signs popping up on a lot of the lawns and in a lot of the windows, hopefully windows, of the town of Westlock. And it's critically important that they do, because the minority of people who voted, and let's be clear, the turnout on this thing was absolutely abysmal, organized by somebody who stood outside of hospitals and yelled at nurses as they were leaving during the pandemic, calling them frauds, say they were lying. This is the caliber of people that we're talking about who are behind this petition and behind driving this vote. Kids should not be in any way hurt because of people like that. So it's fantastic that people are stepping up to let kids know that they absolutely do matter, because 24 votes is an embarrassment. And I sincerely hope that the town of Westlock and the council of Westlock recognizes that the parameters of this petition are incredibly limited, and there's a lot of sidewalks that could use a lot of color. Moving on from there, I think we might be at the halfway mark. That's what I get for not doing a live show for 3 weeks. Danielle Smith. She did an address to the province where it was a strange little event, because when you take a look at what Danielle Smith on her last address to the province, it was fire and brimstone, and we're going to fight the feds, and. And this was much more in line with actually her policy announcement, where rather than make some bold statements, it was more than anything a sales pitch to Albertans. But it also included a very important little tidbit.
Although I'm pleased to report that spending cuts will not be needed to balance this year's budget, lower resource revenues will certainly require us to show more restraint than previously predicted. We will ensure this is done thoughtfully and with priority given to the programs and services Albertans most rely on, such as health, education, and social supports. In addition, promised personal income tax cuts will have to wait a year and be phased in responsibly.
Promise made, promise broken. One of Danielle Smith's key campaign promises was that she was going to make sure that we're going to do a tax break for a bunch of people. And people have been asking about it ever since the election, almost a year ago. And her reaction has been, it's coming. We just got to work out the details. We're going to phase it in. And now she's come out and said, yeah, so that thing that I promised, I'm not actually going to do for at least a year, and then we'll phase it in responsibly. But the rest of the address was entirely a sales pitch for reinvesting in the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. Danielle Smith's argument is that if we exercise some fiscal restraint right now, then we can reinvest in the Heritage Savings Trust Fund. And by doing so, we'll be able to invest enough money that we can comfortably live off the interest for the rest of our days. What a wonderful gift to give our kids. And if it sounds familiar, it's because it is.
First of our pledges, and we're calling it our Wild Rose Pledge, is a pledge to balance the budget and start saving again. We would bring in a Balanced Budget and Saving Act that has really three elements. One is to stop running deficits and entrench that in no deficit rule in law. The second is to limit year-over-year spending increases in law to make sure that the budget does not increase by more than inflation and population growth. And the third thing is to grow our Heritage Savings Trust Fund up to an amount that allows it to start spinning off enough investment income that it can really provide that long-term financial security. We set a target of growing the fund to $200 billion within the next 20 years, and we think it's an ambitious target, but we think it's an achievable one.
So that audio was from 2012. It's over a decade old. But when you listen to the policies that Danielle Smith, then leader of the Wild Rose, talks about, that's literally the entire slate of UCP policies that have been enacted, which is fascinating. It's fascinating for a whole bunch of different reasons. One of them is, as we talked to earlier, Danielle Smith hasn't changed her mind about anything. Now, there are economists who say, hey, it would be great if we could get all of this investment in the Heritage Saving Trust Fund, but the problem is that governments go in and consistently rate it whenever they need to. So as much as Danielle Smith is putting the pitch forward to Albertans, hey, you know what, would be great if we could save some money to put into this thing, she is at the same time saying we're going to have to exercise some fiscal restraint, which is wild given that this week also saw the final postings for the amounts of the trips, the cost of some of the sections of Danielle Smith's trip to Dubai. And for Danielle Smith to stand up in front of Albertans and say, hey, you know what? We got to save some money, y'all. We got to be more responsible with money for the kids. After she just spent $50,000 on luxury hotel rooms for a trip to Dubai that she didn't accomplish anything with. I mean, the hotel had its own private beach, so that's nice. But it creates some dissonance when you're going, on one hand, we have to be responsible with our money. We're going to have to cut some corners and trim the fat. And also, I would still like to go to Dubai for my hotel with the private exclusive beach for no discernible reason. And I think I'll probably take my entourage too. That's cool, right? But it's also important to highlight, given that we know those policies came from Danielle Smith, Wild Rose 2012, what are some of the other goals that Danielle Smith would like to see? Because she didn't talk about, hey, we could invest so much more in healthcare. She didn't talk about, hey, we could invest so much more in education. She said she wouldn't cut, additionally, healthcare and education. But if we go back to the past, compliments of, again, the amazing Twitter account at Disordered YYC. Again, I know I say this every time we refer to their clips. That last clip was from them. They're an anonymous Twitter account, but they should be a mandatory follow for anybody who pays attention to Alberta politics. At Disordered YYC, they found this clip, which maybe explains a little bit more about why Danielle Smith wants to undergo some austerity in order to build up the Heritage Savings Trust Fund.
I'd love to challenge Albertans to think about this, because if we got started now and we allowed the revenues to generate over time, we could grow it to the same size that Norway has. Norway, I think, is approaching $1 trillion. Imagine if we had $500 billion in that fund and it was generating a 5% return, that's $25 billion. That's enough to eliminate personal income tax and eliminate corporate income tax. So if we did a little bit of belt tightening and savings now, we could really create something quite glorious in about 30 years' time that would be a true legacy to hand off to our kids.
What if we eliminated corporate income tax? When we take a look at Danielle Smith's policies through the lens of not what's best for Albertans, but rather what's best for corporations, and we take a look at all of the lobbying work that she did, particularly with the Alberta Enterprise Group, it starts to become the investments in the arena. It starts to become almost suggestive of the idea that maybe Danielle Smith isn't actually all that interested in serving Albertans. She's more interested in serving the ultra wealthy. But all jokes about that being the very first episode of Alberta Update, because Bruce was helping Danielle Smith with her leadership campaign on that one. We now got to start talking about your province, your premier. Because every 2 weeks, Danielle Smith does her little radio show where she answers, air quotes, questions from callers. And when we say answer questions, sometimes she answers questions, sometimes she does the Gish Gallop, and sometimes she just straight up starts to show how little she actually knows about things. And one of the big topics that they spent some time on yesterday was healthcare.
Part that we're trying to assess is, why do we have a constant crisis in acute care? Why is it that we're constantly told that beds are full, they're at 100% capacity, they're at 105% capacity? And part of the reason for that is that we have people who are in acute care beds who should either be in continuing care, mental health facilities, they should be in addictions treatment, they should be at home with home care, or they're awaiting some kind of support for rental housing. We just got an assessment of how many alternative level of care patients there were in our acute care beds. It's 1,550 of 6,400 beds. If you're wondering why we have problems in our Alberta health system, is that the most expensive door and the most expensive bed is being occupied by somebody who should be in an alternative level of care. So that is what we are trying to solve. And that is a management issue. This is the reason why I have told managers, you must prove your value. And a manager who sat there and allowed for somebody to sit in a bed for literally 800 days because all they needed was to get their tax return done so that they could figure out how much support they were entitled to. If a manager wasn't able to see that and move it, that's a manager who shouldn't be there anymore. We have stories like this all over the place of people who have been languishing in acute care beds for 100 days, 200 days. That one's actually 891 days. So don't tell me I need to hire more managers. I need to hire fewer managers. I need managers to do their darn job. And if they don't do their darn job, we're not going to hire more of them. We're going to hire more frontline workers.
You know when somebody's so close to getting it that it just hurts to watch them sail right by the actual thing because they were so close to landing it and then they just missed it entirely? That's what Danielle Smith does in that clip. So she's right. There's an acute care problem. There's a huge problem that exists in hospital with backlog. There's a huge problem that exists because there are patients who should be in alternative or other care facilities that would be more appropriate for them, but they can't get into them. And so that backlog backs up all the way through the system, and it ends up backing up into the emergency room, and it ends up with really long waits in emergency rooms. It ends up with staff being burnt out. It ends up with ambulances not getting back on the streets. There's no question that the problem is there are a significant number of people who have not been able to get into appropriate care. And that's where Smith loses the plot. Because she likes to use this example of this patient who has been in care for 800 and some odd days. And the thing is, when she first started telling that story, when Adriana Grange first started telling that story, we started asking around to some smart people who actually work in the hospitals. And we heard back from some smart people who actually work in the hospitals. And let's be clear, it's not a management issue. It's an easy thing to try to pin it on. But there's some very basic questions that if you start to ask, it becomes fundamentally clear, well, there's some bullshit going on here. How does a person sit in hospital for over 800 days and not leave because they just haven't been able to file their taxes? I mean, taxes suck. Nobody likes doing taxes. But you have to, if you stop and think about it for a second, maybe there's some additional obstacles that exist for this person to be able to do their taxes. But wait a second, if they're going to go to a provincially funded continuing care space, then they shouldn't have any problems getting into one of those because it's funded by the province. So why would they need their taxes to be funded? Unless, of course, there are no spaces available in the public facilities. And unless, of course, it's actually private facilities that are getting public money that are refusing to accept that patient because of the complexity. And maybe the reasons why, a small part of the problem, is that they need to get their taxes done. They need to figure out what their financial resources are going to look like, is because that's going to determine how much they need to top up the funding that exists to get someone into long-term care into a private facility that will accept them. Because that's the problem. That's the backlog. Private facilities don't want to take patients or people that require higher levels of care because that means they have to do more work. And while they're publicly funded, they're still private organizations and they like to make money. Because I guess they figured out that they could buy things with money, and that's a nice thing to be able to do. So when we're talking about people waiting for being unable to get out of the hospitals, it's not because management is unaware of the problem. To make that argument, you're also suggesting that every single person who's interacted with those people who have been in hospitals for months or in some cases years just don't care. They've never bothered to raise their concerns to a supervisor or a manager. And that supervisor has never bothered to raise their concerns to the manager or the powers that be. It's just a problem of nobody cares, you see, because there's no other way to interpret that argument. The reality is that there are some people who are in hospital for unacceptably long periods of time, but it's not management's fault. It's not the healthcare workers' fault, and it's certainly not the patient's fault. It's the fault of the fact that we've built a long-term care system in this province where the publicly funded, publicly administered beds are incredibly in short supply, and the privately run, publicly funded beds get to decide what patients they're going to accept. So again, it almost brings up this argument that if we're going to profitize our healthcare system, as Danielle Smith very clearly wants to do with the implosion of AHS, it's going to come at a cost. And it's unfortunate that Danielle Smith is weaponizing people who can't get into appropriate levels of publicly funded but privately administered care because the system has been set up in a way that if you're a company who's receiving public money and you don't want to deal with someone who's going to be a lot of work, you can just say no. And rather than addressing that issue, she's going to pin it on managers and, by extension, everybody who is in interaction with that patient. But Smith had some other thoughts as to why the healthcare system is having so many problems.
Look, I can tell you where we're at on trying to assess the problem that we have in Alberta Health Services, and it's a twofold problem that we have. One is that we have an org chart that is 663 pages long. If you want to get an idea of why we have such a management problem, 663 pages is their org chart. So we are slowly working our way through that to decide where those positions should be. Should we be hiring them at all? Should they be in the department? So that's one part of it.
You see, it's the org chart, but maybe we should talk about what an org chart is, because there might be some people, like apparently Danielle Smith, who don't know what an org chart is. You see, when you have an org chart, what that does is it lists off everybody who works in that organization and who they report to and who that person reports to, and. Now, 663 pages, that's clearly a management problem, except when we're talking about the system that is Alberta Health Services, when we're talking about the size of the thing that is Alberta Health Services, we got to talk about the size of the thing that is Alberta Health Services. So how big is Alberta Health Services should be the first question. How many employees does Alberta Health Services have? Well, we checked. It's 135,000. There are 135,000 people that are employed by Alberta Health Services. That's 135,000 names on an org chart. If you break that down, that works out to roughly 204 names per page. Now, to give you a little bit of context, we decided to do a little experiment and take a look, open up a document, just a regular document. What happens if you open up a regular document? Well, you get 54 lines per page at 11-point font, which is a smaller font, to be sure. And if you put 204 names on a page, just the names, not the titles, nothing like that, no other information, just the names, this right here is what 204 names looks like on a single page. This is Danielle Smith written out on a page. No other information. So as easy as it is to say, oh, it's this huge org chart, 663 pages, presumably there's a title page in there as well. It's not unreasonable for an organization that employs 135,000 people to have a really big org chart, because there's a lot of people in the organization. But Danielle Smith had some other thoughts that she wanted to share. And one of the ones that got the most attention had to do with the renewables situation, because Danielle Smith put a moratorium on renewables for reasons that we still don't know, because everybody that she said asked for it has said, no, we didn't ask for it. And there's been a lot of questions about what's it going to look like when the renewables moratorium is lifted. What are the policies that Danielle Smith is going to implement? Because one of the big justifications that she threw out and maintained up until yesterday was, well, you know, somebody's got to be responsible for the cleanup. There's this concrete that's left in the ground after a wind turbine goes down, and the solar panels, they have to be put away. So who's gonna pay for all of that? And there's some legitimate questions about that, for sure. Was it worth a 7-month moratorium? Most people say no. But her justification changed a little bit yesterday, and she tipped her hand in regards to what actually is going to be announced in just a couple of days.
Some comment that about 100 projects worth more than $33 billion were put on hold throughout the moratorium process. Are we going to get those back?
We'll get back as much as we can bring on as with gas at the same time. Like, again, there's no point in me bringing on 33,000 megawatts of wind and solar if none of it's going to work when it's minus 35 on January 13th when it's 5 o'clock at night. You can build 100,000 megawatts of solar, and if the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, you still get zero power. So that's what I'm saying. We need to bring on a responsible amount of wind and solar and always ensure that we have enough baseload dispatchable power so that it can be backed up. So it might be a slower pace of growth.
So what she's saying there is any development of renewables has to be matched by development of other ables. We know Danielle Smith loves the natural gas, but there's some very real flaws to her argument. We're going to let somebody else address those in just a minute. But what she's saying is if you want to build renewables, renewable power to sell to the grid in the province of Alberta, then you also have to match it with natural gas. Hey, have we heard Danny say this anywhere else before?
I don't know if this is the solution, but I seem to recall that this was the policy in Montana, that if you did want to sell into the grid, you had to be able to firm up your supply. So if you were a wind producer and you could produce 100 megawatts of wind at your peak, you had to always be able to produce 100 megawatts, which created that healthy dynamism that they had to partner with some other type of generation. I think in most cases it was natural gas to make sure they could firm up the supply.
So let's be clear. Danielle Smith is saying right there that what she would like to see is if you're going to have that video, again, Compliments of Disordered. I don't know how they go through all of her Danny's back catalog, but it's remarkable. But what she's saying there is that if you want to have renewables, then you also have to partner with somebody to make sure it's matched with natural gas. And there's always this conversation that goes on about, well, what about the really bad days? Well, it's worth noting that when we're talking about the January event where there were almost rolling brownouts across the province of Alberta, it happened at a time of day when, yes, wind and solar weren't producing because the sun had gone down and the wind wasn't blowing. That's a fair statement. But it also happened at a time where there were multiple gas plants that were offline. It also happened at a time where a new gas plant that's going to be putting out significant amounts of energy wasn't online yet. So the problem, in many ways, will have already solved itself in just a couple of weeks. But there's a better question that perhaps need to be asked. With Albertans universally complaining about the cost of electricity, what would, if there were more wind and solar, what would the effects of that be? Let's ask somebody who thinks that they're, I don't know, an expert.
You're going to get a lot of excess power for both solar and wind when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing.
So you're going to get a lot of excess power when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing. If you have a glut of supply, what would that do to the price of the things? I think that there's some sort of economic law of supply and something where if you have a lot of supply, then the price goes down. So even if you want to make the argument for making sure that there is a minimum base load power, even if that's what you want to do, that's still not a compelling argument to not aggressively move ahead with renewables when private companies want to invest in the province of Alberta to build more renewables. Because what would it do during those periods, to say nothing of storage, but during those periods when wind and solar is producing, it could drive the prices down, which is the one thing that we hear at all levels of government people are deeply, deeply concerned with. It was also one of the big topics that came up repeatedly on that episode. So you have to ask the real question of why doesn't Danny want to go ahead with renewables? Why does she want to tie it to oil and gas? It's almost as if she spent years lobbying for oil and gas. But she also had some thoughts about how... I knew I wasn't going to be able to get through this bit with a straight face. She also had some thoughts about how the relationship works between ministers and and heads of state. She's apparently had some revelations in that department recently.
I think, though, that Guilbeault is Trudeau's proxy, and Trudeau actually shares the same ideologies.
You know, Marianne, I was willing to give Trudeau the benefit of the doubt until this week, when he came into town, blew in with, barely any notice, didn't tell us why he was here, went on the air, slammed me, slammed our oil sands, slammed any worker who's been fooled to think that the oil sands companies are actually going to get to net zero, and then breezed out again. And when I saw that, I realized that he is actually the proxy for what Trudeau truly believes. I thought that we were engaging in good faith with the federal government on trying to get aligned to a pathway to carbon neutrality by 2050.
Yeah,
and
you've also got the Alberta group, the Alberta Ottawa group, that is trying to find some consensus. So does this kind of political posturing by the Prime Minister harm any kind of progress that group might be achieving?
All I can say is that that sounds like campaigning. That sounds like election talk. It sounds like he's once again following the same old pattern of trying to demonize Alberta so that he can win votes in Eastern Canada. And if that's the case, if we're headed to election, then let's get it on. Let's have an election. Let's put the ideas on the table. Let's either get him another 4-year mandate so we can get back to business and be grown-ups about how we engage with each other, or let's have a change of government so that we can have a government in place that doesn't continue targeting Alberta unfairly. But if that's what he's doing, is electioneering for the point of trying to earn points and votes in other parts of the province or other parts of the country, then call an election already.
Now, there's a lot to unpack here. Because on one hand, we've got Danny saying, I had no idea that a minister would be acting on... I had no idea that a minister would be acting on the instructions of a head of state, as if she's never written mandate letters for any of her ministers, or as if she hasn't chosen ministers for the specific reasons that they would do the things that she wanted them to do. Even though that's exactly what she's done. And she refers to the mandate letters that she's provided for her ministers many times. So for Danielle Smith to feign shock that any minister at the federal level is acting on the instructions of the Prime Minister is disingenuous, to say the least. But there's the other part that we got to talk about, because Danielle Smith goes on to say, hey, Justin Trudeau, he's just demonizing one specific group, and that's not okay. You shouldn't demonize one specific group. And if you're going to do that, if you're going to make it clear that you're not interested in representing everybody, well, that should be cause for an election. Because if you're not going to behave like a grown-up and you're just going to demonize a group to try to score political points based on the audience that you're with, that's not okay, right? Progress Alberta Audio?
We want to be known as the kind of government who isn't afraid to tackle the difficult issues. And we don't want to be dissuaded from taking the hard decisions because of a little bit of noise and emotion that happens out there. You've probably seen that the left has their head explode almost every other day. Some of the things that we do, we've got so much more coming, though. They don't know what's about to hit them.
The left's heads are exploding. We've got so much more coming. They don't know what's about to hit them. Something, demonizing a group. That audio was from the progress report from an event that happened just a few days ago, where Danielle Smith was speaking to a wealthy group of oil and gas folks, and she decided that as much as it's totally not okay for Justin Trudeau to demonize a specific group, it's totally okay for her to demonize a specific group, the left. Again, it's the double standard that we get from Danny over and over and over again. But there's one more clip that we got to play before we open it up for our open mic. If there is anybody who wants to tap in tonight, if you do, then hop on over to the Twitter Spaces, and it's got to be on a mobile device. You can't do it on a computer or a tablet. It's got to be on a cell phone. But if you do want to share some thoughts, then hop on in, because in about 5 minutes, we're going to open it up for open mic. If anybody wants to tell us what we got wrong or what we got right or anything else, it's an open forum. You can do that on the Twitter Spaces in just a couple of minutes. But before we do, we got to talk about Danielle Smith's other big policy announcement. And it has to do with political parties, not at the provincial level, not at the federal level, but at the municipal level.
Calls to allow the establishment of city or municipal political parties. These are parties not necessarily tied to provincial or federal parties, but they would be political parties nonetheless. That would require, as I understand it, some kind of provincial government approval. What's the process? How likely is that to happen?
Well, I'm in favor, especially for the largest municipalities. Maybe not everyone. I mean, we've got 355 municipalities, and the smaller the municipality, I don't know that they're as partisan. But when you get into a city the size of Calgary or Edmonton, you better believe it's partisan. I know everybody thinks that it's not, but did anyone really know that there were going to be single-use plastics and paper bans that happened in Calgary and Edmonton in the last election? Don't you think people should have campaigned on that? It's been, I think they're revisiting it in Calgary, but they still have it in Edmonton, and it just came out of the blue. So I think because we are now at a point where Calgary and Edmonton decision makers are moving beyond the things that cities normally do. Cities normally do things like infrastructure. They make sure that your lights stay on if you're with NMAX or EPCOR. They make sure that you can get your garbage picked up. They make sure that you get water. They make sure that the parks and the streets are cleared. So I would say that because they are now getting far more political and far more ideological, there probably needs to be a little more transparency about that. So maybe not every municipality, but...
So what's the process then? How do we get to that point?
Well, I guess we'll have to see what my Minister of Municipal Affairs comes up with. I mean, I've told him on that what I think about it, but I'm not the only decision maker here. We have to put it around the cabinet table, the caucus, get consultation and feedback, and there'll be legislation that addresses this in this spring session.
There will likely be legislation that addresses it in the spring session, which is in just a couple of weeks. So it's a little disingenuous for Smith to say, well, we'll have to see what my minister comes up with because, I do this consultation with my cabinet and then caucus and everybody else, despite the fact that we heard from a minister the day before Smith announced her anti-trans policies that had not been discussed around the caucus or the cabinet table, and she moved on it pretty much unilaterally because she is, in fact, the only decision maker because she's built it that way. Because that's Alberta now. But it's also worth noting that just because Danny doesn't know a thing happened doesn't mean a thing happened. Because after we posted this clip, we had multiple city councilors who campaigned on the issue of single-use plastics who were elected comment and say, hey, actually, here's the press release that I did when I was campaigning where I said this was an issue and this is how I felt about it. This issue in Edmonton goes back all the way to 2018, 2019. So to try to suggest that nobody knew about the issue is, again, either Danny doesn't know what she's talking about or Danny likes to pretend that she doesn't know what she's talking about in order to politicize an issue at the same time as criticizing municipal governments for being overly politicizing. It gets very confusing very quickly. But all of that brings us to the last clip that we want to share from your province, your premier, before we open it up to the open mic. Because this one really sort of encapsulates the lessons that really, we would argue, anyone should take from this entire episode. So we'll let the premier of the province explain what we should be looking for.
Just it. Proof is in the pudding. It's people can only judge you by your actions as opposed to your words.
Can't trust somebody's words. You can only trust their actions. Like not campaigning on an Alberta pension plan, but spending millions of dollars on an advertising campaign after the election to convince Albertans that it's a good idea. Like a renewables moratorium that wasn't campaigned on or mentioned whatsoever, like increasing gift amounts for MLAs and staffers because Danny was pissed off that you couldn't get into the high-end owners boxes at a sports game, like lavish trips abroad for no discernible reason, while at the same time using words that say that we have to be fiscally responsible, like an unprovoked, unpredicated attack on trans kids, sex education, adult choice in sport, like all of a sudden deciding that we needed to expand the Heritage Fund, even though that didn't come up in the election, like deciding that coal mines, even if it's not the same company, should still be considered an existing project, and the Minister of Energy steps in to push it over the line. Or like saying that you're going to fix utilities, the cost of utilities. You're going to address the cost of living by fixing utility prices and by fixing insurance prices, and then not. Like saying that you're going to introduce a tax credit and then not. If we take a look at a person's actions only instead of their words, it becomes very clear how we should be measuring the honesty and the intent of the current provincial government. Because there's a lot of games that are being played, and it's not okay. That's the end of our program proper. And so I want to thank everybody for sitting through all of that. And this is the part of the show where we open it up for our open mic. So once again, if you want to weigh in on any of these issues, or if you have something that you want to bring our attention to, then we would ask that you hop over to the Twitter Spaces, join the conversation there, and we can bring you in for it. We do have one of our regular speakers. She's very, very quick to already get into the queue. We're going to add Cassandra as a speaker, and we're going to see what's going on. So Cassandra, what's the haps?
Oh, gee, Nate, I'm just, where do I start?
Right?
I know where I'm going to start. I'm going to start with a history lesson. So it's been on my mind listening to the NDP candidates that have come forward. It has brought it up, but also I was in BC, and my great grandfather, I think I've said that he was a machinist and a trade unionist. He was also a small farmer. And he was at the Winnipeg General Strike. And I've been learning a little bit more about his involvement with things like the CCF. But there's some history that I think people, and it just galls me that people in Alberta don't know this history, especially the people that seem to want to vote for people like Danielle Smith. So I'm going to give a history lesson today. At least that's how I'm going to. I got a couple history lessons. This is the first one. It was in 1932, and in 1932, the socioeconomic situation as well as the agricultural situation on the prairies was quite dire. People were in untenable working conditions at hard labor and trades jobs, working extreme hours with very little pay, putting their lives at risk. And another thing that was happening, because, a lot of people came from other places to the prairies of Canada to homestead, and they were given these pieces of land to farm, and not all of them had ever farmed before, and they weren't really very experienced at it. And another event came to be, and that event that came to be was actually, it was a moment of man-made climate change, most famously known as the Dust Bowls. And it was how we ended the Dust Bowls was actually by changing the way we farmed so that we were better replenishing the land. But in 1932, these laborers that had been organizing to fight against employers, and these small farming organizations. So these were small farmers that organized and made their own organizations. One of the largest of these organizations, one of the biggest and most prolific in the history lesson I'm going to give, is an organization that is still there today. I'm actually a member. It's called the UFA, the United Farmers of Alberta. And them and a lot of other small farming organizations on the prairies teamed up with these laborers and stuff. And they created a new political party, which was founded on August 1st, 1932, in none other than Calgary, Alberta. And the UFA was actually the political party provincially in power at the time, because they then had a political wing which they later dissolved, because of course they became a part of forming this new cooperative Commonwealth Federation, which was, or the CCF as everybody knows it. And, another thing that happened is, much later in 1961, on August 3rd, 1961, again, in Calgary, Alberta, at a convention, the CCF had a vote, and they decided to change their name and restructure their party into the NDP. And I don't think many people know that Alberta was a big part of creating this party. It was a federalist party. At their creation in 1932, when they went to the election, they immediately sent 8 MPs to Ottawa, as well as got elected in provincial governments. I mean, and we all remember, most people think of it being Saskatchewan because they remember Tommy Douglas. Well, he was the leader of the provincial in Saskatchewan, and he got elected to lead Saskatchewan. And of course, I'm trying to compact a lot of things into a short space here. So forgive me for what I've left out and the dots I'm not connecting. But I think that's an important thing to understand, is that a big part of why they were formed and why small people in agriculture and trades and stuff created this party was because of they were facing very much the same thing that we are facing right here, right now, especially in Alberta, and that you've pretty much covered in your entire show. These were the same. The conditions are very similar to what was going on then and why the party was created. And so, I just want people to reflect on that and dig down and maybe go dig into if you've been a multi-generational farming family, dig into your history, learn about it. Like I've been learning about my history as from my roots, my family roots in small farming on the prairies, and really learn about that history and why. And it's a big reason why the NDP, as we know today, has been so strong on environment, because that's how they started. Because environment ultimately affects agriculture. If we don't have water, we have nothing for cattle to drink. We have nothing to water the crops with, to feed people. And as much as people like to talk about, they often refer to the oil and gas industry as being the largest industry in Alberta. It in fact is not the largest industry.
No, it's not.
It's been the most profitable industry for a few decades, but the largest and oldest industry in this province is agriculture. And right now, we've got a party in place that does not give a damn about our traditional, long-standing agricultural industry, which, agriculture will sustain us. It's what feeds us, and it was here long before oil and gas and mining, and it will be around long after. And it's essential that we really focus on maintaining that and look after our big interests. I mean, we also are an energy province, and And being an energy powerhouse does not have to mean that it all has to come from oil and gas. When I moved back to this province, oh God, it's 23 years ago, 22 years ago now, when I moved back again. And one of the things that struck me after living in BC for a while, because everybody's always talking about the environment and green energy, and the bad Alberta. Well, one of the things that struck me, and I think I've said this on the show before, was I couldn't believe how far ahead Alberta was in the research and development of renewable technologies. And that was everything from wind, solar to geothermal. And we don't talk enough about geothermal, because geothermal does not require the sun to shine or the wind to blow.
Yep.
And all these things work in unison together. So if one's down, then there's another one to back it up, and there's a way to do it. So this idea that if the wind stops blowing, that's it for the energy, it all stops. No, they're meant to work in unison together. It's one lifts up the other when the other's down, and geothermal is, we've got the first and the largest geothermal plant in North America is right here in Alberta. And that's due to Alberta innovation. And so this idea of us being an energy province, it does not mean that we're just a solely oil and gas province. It doesn't mean, we also are agriculture, and we also have been the leader for decades in the research and development of the renewable technologies that are being used around the world today. And that's what I had to say on that.
I want to tack something into what you said there, because one of the things that drives me up the wall when I hear people talk about industry in Alberta is, what are the industries that provide Albertans with the most jobs? And I'm literally looking at the table right now for employment by industry. The biggest employer in Alberta is healthcare and social assistance. It employs 330,000 people. After that is retail and trade. After that is professional scientific and technical services. After that is construction. After that is educational services. After that is transportation and warehousing. And then we finally get to mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction at 143. So they're like 8th on the list, and they employ less than half of the people that healthcare does. So there's my rant on that.
No, thank you. I mean, that just adds to the whole thing, because guess what? The CCF and now the NDP, I mean, it's the same party. One of the things that they brought about was things like, and they put pressure on the people in power, and they're the reason that we have universal health care. They're the reason we have WCB, employment insurance, and other social programs that we didn't have before. They had the idea of creating a social safety net so that when people were in hard times, that nobody had to be left behind, right? Because they were the ones being left behind.
Yeah.
And they were the workers. I mean, this idea that it's created for people that are too late. No, it was workers that created these things, people that labored hard and worked hard, and were not getting a fair deal.
Yeah.
And that's happening right now again. And you're right. It's happening in all the professions that you just mentioned, which are, like you said, these are our largest employers. And so I have to say that, and because I think it's really important that we all reflect and maybe look into our family histories and ask ourselves what part we had in that, our families had in that, because were we really for decades, I mean, were we really, is this really a solely conservative, traditionally conservative province? No, it's not a traditionally conservative province. In fact, I'd say the conservatism was moving away from tradition, if you ask me, but that's my opinion, that part.
That's fair. Can I hop in
I want to make one more note.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to be quick, because I got a speaker that I really want to get to.
Okay. And I just wanted, because I brought this up before, but I heard it on the, somebody brought up on MSNBC. I heard this name come up, and it was called, it was the Heritage Front Foundation. And I think I've talked about the Heritage Front Foundation and their involvement One of the big reasons the Reform Party lost a lot of steam after winning official opposition status and had to change their name to the Alliance was because of a declassified CSIS document that there's links to it. Anybody can see it. I've tweeted it out many times. That talks about, it was their involvement and the prolific amount of members they had from the Heritage Foundation, which is a neo-Nazi organization. But more importantly is this thing that this, I don't know what you would call it. It's Preston Manning's manifesto. It's called the Reform Party Blue Book. And that if you look at the moves that Danielle Smith is making right now, and every single note that you touched upon on this show, if you go read that Blue Book, you will see that that's what she's doing. And I'm just going to leave it at that. But if you read the Blue Book and then look back on this episode and everything that this what you presented to us, this horrifying picture, that's where it comes from. I swear to God.
I believe you. I've skimmed it. I haven't done the in-depth read on it yet, just because there's
so much.
There's so much. But
yeah. Anyway, that's my TED Talk for tonight, and
awesome.
I will let you go get on to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. And if you have anything else that you want to weigh in at towards the end, by all means, please do. But we have a new speaker tonight, and I actually was in the background sending a message. No, please get them to come back. So I want to make sure that I give them the space to say whatever it is that they want to say, because I received a message saying that this person did have some things that they wanted to raise. So all of that being said, I'm very excited to welcome to the show, I believe, Dr. David Keegan. How are you doing tonight, sir? And this is where we do the first timer thing where I say, you got to hit the little unmute thing on the bottom left-hand corner of your device.
Perfect. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can. How are you doing, sir?
Okay, I guess.
Okay, well, that's restrained. Let's find out why. I got a message saying that you had some things that you wanted to share. I believe, I mean, it's been a breakneck day at the breakdown here today, but I believe that you were a speaker at an event in Edmonton. And so I'm going to open up the floor, and it's all yours.
Hi. So thanks very much. It's late, and it's been a horrible 2 days. The short version is 2 nights ago, 2 members of the Calgary Police Service came to my home and asked to come inside and speak with me. And that's when I learned that my trans nephew had died by suicide. As a rational person, as just a person in our world, and also as a family doc, I sort of figured and thought there's a reasonable chance that these horrible policies that were unveiled in that disgusting video by Premier Smith probably didn't help. And yesterday, I learned that they not just didn't help, that they were a contributing cause, that my trans nephew had been worried for quite some time and actually had messaged me in the past about concerns about the growing trans hate in the United States and in Canada, but that specifically he was very scared and felt quite isolated as a direct result of Premier Danielle Smith's unveiling of her planned policies. And so I'm from Calgary, also known as McKinses, the traditional territories of the people of the Blackfoot Confederacy, as well as Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3, and near the people, the Goodstoney people. I'm in Edmonton now, though, because I have to go clear out my nephew's place. I have to work with the Edmonton Police Service, the medical examiner's office, and so on, to navigate the death by suicide of my nephew. And so you said earlier, I'm sorry I wasn't able to hear the whole thing. It's just been a very challenging day and challenging weekend and challenging time. And but I heard you say earlier, it's only a matter of time before kids get harmed as a result of Danielle Smith's.
Are you still there, Dr. Keegan?
Sorry, I'm back again. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, my phone just went to the homepage thing. Sorry, and then that shut it off. Sorry about that.
It's all good.
So anyway, so I'm here to clear out his apartment. The reason he's dead, well, it's complex, but a direct contributing factor was the announcement by Premier Smith. And so you said earlier in the show, it's only a matter of time before some people die as a result, get hurt as a result of her policies that she unveiled. And my nephew was 37, so not a kid or a teen anymore. But still, we now have at least one person's death, which we can directly draw a line to Premier Smith and the kind of hate that she and Pierre Poilievre and their ilk are promoting. I also blame or think other people who are accountable are all of those, every single UCP MLA who's sitting in caucus, who was quite happy to let their leader choose hate, choose cruelty. Because remember, it was something like 10 years ago or so when she stood up as a member of the Wild Rose Party and talked about the need actually to protect and provide opportunities for people who are trans. And she took a libertarian framework or perspective on it, as I recall. And yet here she is now spewing hate, pretending to care when actually unveiling a horrible series of things which are setting back not just trans rights, but actually the rights of children to learn about their own bodies and sexual health. It's the most regressive set of such policies any of us have seen in Canada. Sadly, they're not the most regressive in the world, but boy, they're trying to get there. And this was all deliberate. She's not ignorant. She knew 10 years ago what the right thing was. She's chosen cruelty. She knows and knew that people would be harmed, that people would die, and now she's got what she planned. There's no way a premier can unveil that set of things, that set of restrictions and prejudices, and pretend to know or pretend to think that people won't get hurt. She knew this was going to happen. She knew it. And all I'm doing is just saying she got what she planned. My nephew's death.
I'm so sorry, sir. It's one of those things that so many people have said. And I think that it's so critically important to highlight that as much as these policies specifically target kids and youth, the rhetoric that's being leveled is absolutely harmful to anybody who is trans or has trans family members or cares about trans people as human beings. We heard from Marnie Panis about the threats and the hate that she's experienced since Smith announced these policies. And I think you're absolutely right, sir. I think that there's no intelligent argument to be made that Danielle Smith could not have seen this coming and that she chose to do it anyways because she's got a leadership review and she's more concerned about saving her own political skin than the literal skin.
Actually, I don't even know if it's even that. This is 100% about control. Is that we have a premier who is just quite happy to control others. She says she's a libertarian. She's not. It's the opposite. A true libertarian would say, you do you. Trans people, fine. Don't, you live your life. But no. So maybe it's about a leadership review. I have no idea. All I know is that the premier of our province, the leader of our province, and the UCP MLAs were all sitting there and allowing her to have that title, they are fully 100% on board with choosing cruelty, choosing death to stay in power, to accrue power, to control people. They like the control. They seem to like the cruelty because every single one of them knew this was going to happen. Every single one of them.
There's no way
And
they
it's not
couldn't
just
have.
them. It's also, the premier of New Brunswick. Happily, he had a revolt. The premier of Saskatchewan and his caucus, and Pierre Poilievre and his caucus. Every single one of those elected people who all happen to be, a conservative or conservative aligned party, every single one of them is just fine with exactly what their leaders are saying, which is exactly opposite to freedom. It's all about control.
You're not wrong, sir. I got a couple things that I want to throw in there, and then I'm going to give you as much space to say whatever else you want to say tonight. First, I want to acknowledge and thank you for the strength and the bravery that it takes to say what you just said in a public forum. I think that it's critically important that it's said in a public forum, because I think that it is only these personal stories that are going to get people to understand the true cost of things. So I want to thank you so much for sharing this tonight. And I had a conversation offline with one of the guests that we've had over the last couple of weeks, and it's no secret that I'm a paramedic professionally. And the comment that I made with that person was, the one thing that I wish I could say is, because I so desperately believe that people need to see the faces and hear the stories. The one thing that I wish I could say to Danielle Smith is, I'll tell you what, the next time I have to go cut a kid down, I'll let you know. And your story tonight, I think, humanizes this issue in a critically important way. So I want to say thank you for that. And I'm just going to get out of your way for anything else that you want to say, sir.
That's it. Thank you. Thank you for your work. We all knew this was going to happen. I don't know. I hope nobody else has to have two police officers on their doorstep asking to come inside and talk to them. It's horrible. It's horrible. It's horrible at the best of times, or what? I don't know. It's horrible if it's a car accident or something. But to learn this kind of thing is just horrible. And horror, as I understand, horrible comes from the word horror. This was a horror that was chosen. That's the key thing. This was a horror that was chosen by our premier and inflicted upon my nephew, and it continues to be inflicted upon anybody who's trans, anybody who has trans people in their family, and anybody who's decent. This was chosen. And so it doesn't stop here. Now, none of us should have to actually think, well, what's next? Am I next? Is the group that I'm in next? None of us should actually have to ask that, because this is just plain wrong anyways. But it's not going to stop here. We all know that there was that survey about underage abortions circulating, the robo survey or whatever it was, the same night as the video. We know that they're not stopping here. And where does this lead? I mean, we all know where it leads. It leads to a state that's controlling people. And so anybody who's listening, or either live or to recording, and you sort of actually are not certain about trans people and what rights they should have and so on, and you're thinking that maybe Danielle Smith is on to something or whatever, and you start thinking, well, maybe actually those parent rights do make sense and so on. No, just the answer to the fear and anger and pain that you might have is not to hate on another group. It's to channel the fear, the hate, and pain you might be feeling into thinking, well, if I'm in pain, if I fear, if I'm angry, or sad, I should channel that into thinking, how do I make this a better place?
I think Dr. Keegan might have gone to the home screen again.
Hey, sorry about that. Do you hear me again?
I do, yes, sir.
Oh man, I kept forgetting to swipe the phone. The bottom line is, anybody who's seduced, like, don't let yourself be seduced. If you have pain, fear, anger, sadness, don't let yourself be seduced and to hate on another group. Instead, channel that into thinking, well, how do we make this a better place for everyone? Because there are a lot of people, as we know, who are thinking, well, maybe there is something there. But the yardstick should be anybody who is seeking to restrict rights, and particularly anybody like the Premier who is wanting to interfere in the direct relationship doctors like me have with our patients, like anybody here on this phone call perhaps, or anybody else. Once you hear a government wanting to get in the way of medical care, just know they're not doing this for the right reasons. It's all about control. So anybody who's thinking Danielle Smith might be right on this, she's not. And maybe you've got pain, anger, sadness, or fear, but do something else with that. Channel it to good, not to evil hate on trans people. And that's all I got. I'm kind of worn out. Tomorrow morning, I head over to my nephew's and start going through things.
Dr. Keegan, I just want to say thank you again, sir. And
thanks for creating the space. Thank you. And sorry about the stupid home screen stuff that cut me off.
That's
right. Take care.
So unbelievably minor. Thank you so much, sir, for speaking and sharing that tonight. And my sincere condolences. I hope that the next couple of days are as not horrible as possible.
Yeah, no, and that's kind of what I'm going for. And, thank you. And for others who are enabling me to channel the outrage and anger I have at Danielle Smith's choice to target people for the simple fact of who they are. Thank you for letting me channel that into advocacy. It's needed, and we all know it's needed. I really hope and pray and wish there's no more people having to tell stories like this, and we all know there will be more, many more. Thank you so much, everybody, and thanks for all those purple hearts and different emojis, everybody. Please hug anybody who's trans in your life extra close. And if it's you, give yourself the most awesome, beautiful hug ever. Take care, everybody.
Dr. David Keegan, everyone. I know we have a couple other speakers in the queue, but one of the things that I've learned over doing this show for the last couple of years is when to pull the plug. And so we're going to wrap it up there. I'm just going to say, as a final thought for everyone, get fucking loud, y'all, because this is the cost. This is real. And I said it earlier this week. I'm going to say it again. If you're one of those people that chooses to ignore David Parker or chooses to ignore what Danielle Smith is doing, you are ignoring their attacks and you are ignoring their victims. It is time to get loud and to start pushing back. And to anybody out there who is hearing this rhetoric from Smith and Parker and the fucking mob on social media, there are good people out there who love you and who will fight for you. And I can only imagine how painful it is on the days when the voices of the bots and the ignorant and the bigots seem so loud. But just try to focus on the fact that there are good people who care about you. And hold on. I'm not even going to plug the things and the stuff tonight, y'all, because it feels gross. So I'm just going to say thank you, everyone, for listening, whether or not you're listening to the live version or whether or not you're watching right now. It always surprises me where the show goes, man. We're going to wrap it up there. We have an episode on Wednesday that feels incredibly awkward to plug, so I'm not going to. We have an episode on Wednesday. It's worth watching, but you should watch this one and share the hell out of Dr. Keegan's story. Thanks, everyone. Good night.